Hello everybody, hope you're doing well and thanks for joining us for another video. Now, the other day, NASA released this photo of Earth, which was taken by the crew of Artemis 2 on board the Integrity spacecraft, and my Twitter feed has been absolutely filled with posts about it since. Quite a few posts are simply people sharing or admiring the photo, but there's a surprising number of posts from people trying to argue it's fake. In fact, when I say trying to argue, many of them aren't even presenting an argument other than basically saying, it's fake because of course it must be fake. Some questioning why you can't see aeroplane trails or satellites in the photos, some questioning why the quality of the photo of Earth is worse than the original blue marble taken during Apollo 17 back in 1972, and a few even claiming that image analyzers have concluded that this is an AI-generated image. So, let's get debunking. All of these people are basically trying to claim that Artemis is fake and that people aren't actually heading to the moon. Which is funny because there are actually amateur astronomers who are tracking Artemis. Astronomy Live, for example, has been doing live streams of his camera attached to his telescope showing Artemis moving across the sky. To start with, let's first clarify exactly what the photo is showing. Obviously, it's Earth, and in regards to the visible land masses, because somebody thought that this was looking out over Australia, it's actually not. The craft is above the Atlantic Ocean, just off the west coast of Africa. On the left of the photo is North Africa, the edge of the Mediterranean, and Spain, and then over on the right we can see bits of South America. It's easier to make out if you rotate the Earth around. The Earth in this photo is basically upside down compared to what we're used to seeing on maps. And the photo wasn't taken by one of the external cameras fitted to the spacecraft, it was taken by Mission Commander Reid Wiseman, looking out of the window of Integrity, and we can actually make out the window frame around the edge of the photo. The photo was taken with a Nikon D5 DSLR. It was shot at a 22mm focal length, so I suspect the lens they used was a 14 to 24mm f2.8, on the basis that this other photo that NASA have released showing the craft inside Integrity was also shot with a Nikon D5 and was shot at 14mm f2.8. And I don't imagine that they're carrying multiple wide-angle lenses. Nerdy side note, they are actually carrying two Nikon D5 cameras, which are a 10-year-old design. They're also carrying a Nikon Z9, which is Nikon's current flagship camera. Now, they chose the D5s because they've been used extensively on board the International Space Station for years and are known to be able to handle the radiation of space just fine. However, NASA are planning to use the Z9s on board the future Artemis 3 and 4 missions, and Reid Wiseman explained during a press conference why they pushed NASA to let them take one to test how well it handled the radiation.
The camera that Artemis 3 will take and Artemis 4 will take to the surface of the moon is going to be a Z9 by Nikon, and we fought pretty hard to get just that camera on board to see what is the radiation environment in deep space going to do to the sensors on that particular camera.
But anyway, back to the Earth photo. I saw this post from Cheney the Vampire Slayer, who asks, so no darkness ever falls on Earth? I think because the surface of Earth in this photo is evenly lit, aside from the glow around the lower right side, and they included an image with a flashlight showing how they think the Earth should look, with the left side being in shadow. However, the arrow labelled sun isn't showing the direction that sunlight is travelling from. The sun is actually behind the Earth in this photo. Integrity was flying into the shadow of Earth as Earth eclipsed the sun. Wiseman actually mentioned this during a live broadcast from onboard Integrity.
Well, first and foremost, we all wanted to give a shout out to our families first, because we are pretty far from Earth and we have not gotten to say hi to them yet. But there was a moment about an hour ago where Mission Control Houston reoriented our spacecraft as the sun was setting behind the Earth. And I don't know what we all expected to see in that moment, but you could see the entire globe from pole to pole. You could see Africa, Europe, and if you looked really close, you could see the northern lights. It was the most spectacular moment, and it paused all four of us in our tracks.
This detail of the sun being behind the Earth is very crucial for a number of points. Firstly, it answers Cheney's question about the apparent lack of darkness. There's not a lack of darkness, it's essentially all darkness. And it explains the apparent drop in quality compared to the 1972 blue marble. This photo was taken as Apollo 17 headed towards the moon, and we're looking at the sunlit side of Earth. Now, this is where a foundational understanding of how cameras work is crucial. Cameras record light to create a photo. In film cameras, the film has light-sensitive coatings to it which react to light. This reaction causes the image to appear on the film. More light on a particular part of the film means more of a reaction. With modern digital cameras that use a sensor, the sensor is made up of millions of tiny photosites. Each photosite can detect incoming photons. These photons create a small electrical charge. More photons detected creates a higher charge. At the end of the capture, that charge is converted into a digital signal. But the amount of ambient light you're dealing with changes between scenarios, such as if you're shooting in sunlight or if you're shooting at night. So we can use what is called the exposure triangle to work around this. We have the lens aperture, which acts much like the pupil of your eye to vary how much light can enter the camera body. Then we have the shutter speed, which is how long the shutter remains open for. So these two settings directly impact how much light is physically reaching the film or the sensor. So if we double the area of the aperture, we get twice as much light. If we half the area, we get half the amount of light reaching the sensor. Likewise, if you double how long the shutter's open for, you get twice the amount of light. If you half the shutter duration, you get half the amount of light. If you double both, you get 4 times the amount of light. If you half both, you get only a quarter. Then we have ISO, which for film was how sensitive the coating was to light. A more sensitive film wouldn't need as much light in order to create a reaction compared to less sensitive film. Now, various films used to have different ways of measuring, but the common way these days is the ISO speed rating. So you'd get ratings like ISO 100, 200, 400, 800 and such. ISO 200 being twice as sensitive as ISO 100, meaning you could get the same exposure with half the amount of light, though more sensitive films would then start to show graining. Now, for digital cameras, you can't physically change the sensitivity of the sensor, however, you can change the signal that comes from it. So, the signal that comes from the photosites is run through an amplifier, which increases the brightness of each pixel. However, this isn't without drawbacks either, because the circuitry within the sensor creates a small amount of electrical interference which mixes with the signal from the photosite and creates some background noise. Now, this isn't a problem at low ISOs because there's so much natural signal generated from the photosites that the background noise is imperceivably small. However, when the signal from the photosites is very weak, the interference is still the same. So it becomes much more noticeable in relation to the signal, and when you amplify the signal, you also amplify the noise. Much like how I'm currently talking to you through a microphone, and the microphone is adding a small amount of background interference, but you don't notice it because the signal generated by my voice is so much greater. However, if I whisper, the signal from my voice is now much weaker. Sure, I can amplify that signal to make my voice easier to hear, but in doing so, it will also amplify the noise generated by the microphone. And it's the same with photos. Boosting the signal can give you the same exposure, but it won't be as clear. And the photo from Artemis was taken at ISO 51200, which any photographer will tell you is an incredibly high ISO. In fact, there's a lot of cameras that can't even reach that high. Now, for example, here's a photo I took of Rusty in bright sunlight at ISO 100. Then I closed the curtains to make the room much darker, and here's a photo of him at ISO 51200. And you can see how much the ISO impacts the image quality because of all that amplified background noise causing grain in the photo. Now, remember how doubling the ISO is doubling the sensitivity? Well, going from ISO 100 and doubling each time to ISO 51200 is doubling the signal 9 times over. That means to get the same exposure with ISO 51200 that you get at ISO 100, you need less than 1/500th the amount of light. Or if I take my model globe and I take a photo of it whilst it's strongly lit from the sun, it looks very crisp and clear. However, if I then move the light source around the back of it, and I'll cover myself in a black sheet to try and minimize how much light is bouncing off the walls to light up the dark side, you can again see I need to really push the ISO in order to make out the labels on this side. And this is all before we factor in that Apollo was shooting with an aperture of f11, whereas the Artemis photo was at f4. That's 3 times more light being able to reach the sensor for Artemis. And the shutter speed of Apollo was 1/250th of a second. Artemis had a shutter speed of only 1/4 of a second, which is another 6 doublings. So to get the same exposure with these 2 different settings, the Artemis shot required only 1/100,000th the amount of light that Apollo did. But the trade-off is significant amounts of noise, which is why it doesn't look as clear as the Apollo 17 photo. Then there's the fact that the Nikon D5 has a 35mm full-frame sensor, which is a pretty big sensor. However, the film on Apollo was 70mm medium format sized film, which has about 4 times the surface area, so is able to capture significantly more light. And this is also why we can see stars in the Artemis photo when we couldn't see any in Apollo. Because the shadow side of Earth here is very faint, so its brightness is much closer to the brightness of the stars. Whereas on the daylight side of Earth, it's so much brighter than the stars. The stars are just too faint to be detected by the camera when the camera is exposing for bright sunlight. Had they tried photographing Earth with those same settings to see the stars, but whilst they were on the daylight side of Earth, they would have just got a completely white shot because everything would have been completely overexposed. I think some people expect the night side of Earth to be pitch black, but that isn't the case, as evident by the fact that you can walk out in the middle of the desert at night, even when the moon isn't in the sky, and provided you give your eyes time to adjust, you can still see what's around you just from the faint light from the stars in the sky. Plus the fact that light from the sun is bouncing around in the atmosphere, hence why the sky doesn't go completely dark as soon as the sun sets. You have twilight. Your part of Earth needs to turn most of the way around from the sun before you get astronomical twilight, where the sky gets to its darkest. And then you have light reflecting off the moon. Now, I know some people will probably snigger and think there's no way there's enough light coming from the moon to light up the Earth. I think the best example to highlight this, though, has to be this time-lapse by Robert Schwartz, which was taken at the South Pole, where it's dark for half the year, thousands of miles away from any potential light pollution. That light in the sky that's going through the frame is actually the moon, not the sun, and yet it's lighting up the ground and it looks like daylight, all because of the camera settings. So there is always some light hitting the surface of Earth, even in the middle of the night. It's just whether you can see it compared to the brightest parts of your vision. In fact, many of us experience this same basic concept every day. If your phone screen brightness is set very low, you can't see your screen when you're in a bright environment. However, when it then goes dark, the screen brightness doesn't change. But because the ambient light has now dropped closer to that of your phone screen, the details of the screen become visible. It's like how you can see far more stars at night when you're away from light pollution, because your eyes can't adjust enough against the light near you to clearly see faint stars. And hence you see stars in this photo. Now, in terms of the stars, I saw a few people questioning what the bright star in the lower right region of the photo is. And actually, it's not a star, it's Venus. Now, I think NASA replied to somebody's comment and some news outlets have pointed out that it's Venus, but I was actually able to verify that it was Venus before I'd seen any mention of this, by the fact that we're looking straight down at the Atlantic Ocean just off the coast of Morocco. So on the opposite side of the globe, it would be broad daylight and they'd be able to see that region of the sky. Obviously, anybody on the ground wouldn't actually be able to see the stars because the sun would be shining on them, but it would allow me to know what stars were in that region of the sky above Earth. So I looked at an antipodal mapper, which showed that directly through that part of Earth came out at around the Solomon Islands. So I looked at stellarium for when the sun was about 45 degrees in the sky from there. And I turned the atmosphere off to be able to see what stars were around the sun, and I noticed that Venus was the brightest object in the sky. Aside from the sun, of course. But not only that, I was able to note that there were other stars around Venus that all match the Artemis photo perfectly. Which you've got to say is pretty damn impressive for what some people claim is an AI image, given how notorious AI image generators are for messing up even the basic things. However, for as much as people are posting screenshots showing what is claiming to be AI analyzers saying this photo is fake, I took the photo from NASA's website and I ran it through 6 different AI analyzer websites, and all of them came back with results of near 100% certainty that the photo isn't fake. In fact, one of the analyzers apparently even claimed that this image was created by a Russian graphics designer called Anton Balaz. However, if you Google him, you can find websites where all his images are posted, and none of them look remotely close to the Artemis photo. In fact, the last one he published was 5 years ago. Now, I did see a post from someone who understood that it was a photo of the shadow side of Earth, but they were questioning why you can see so much detail of the backside of Earth when the sun goes behind it, but you don't see that much detail of the moon when the sun's behind it. From our perspective here on Earth, during an eclipse, the sun and the moon appear roughly the same size as each other. However, the sun has its corona, which is basically the outermost atmosphere of the sun, and it stretches for millions of miles out into space. That's what you can see in this image here. It's faint compared to the rest of the sun, so we typically don't see it apart from during an eclipse. However, it's still much brighter than the shadow side of the moon, which is being mainly illuminated by sunlight reflecting off the Earth. Meaning you're seeing quite a difference between the dark regions of the moon versus the bright regions of the surrounding space and the solar corona. However, if you were to fly much closer to the moon would then appear much larger than the sun, and it would completely block it out, not only the sun, but also the corona. We saw this the other day as Artemis flew into the shadow of the moon. We see the sun itself become obstructed by the moon, but there's still a bright glow showing. This is the sun's corona, and we're seeing much the same with the photo of Earth. Not only is the Earth much larger than the moon, but the photo was taken much closer to the Earth, so it's blocking more of the sun than when the moon is blocking the sun from our perspective. And for those people asking why you can't see plane trails or satellites, satellites are typically only visible near sunrise or sunset. Satellites don't have their own lights on board. What you see is reflections of the sun. Now, people often comment you don't see satellites on footage from the ISS, which isn't actually true. You don't see them on the daylight side for much the same reason that you don't see stars in the footage, as we've already covered. And you don't generally see them way onto the dark side either, because the satellites are then also in shadow. But on the ISS footage, you often see lots of them as the ISS approaches sunrise, and any satellites that are ahead of them are closer to the sunrise. Then there's the size aspect, which is key. Satellites are typically about the size of a car. So essentially consider looking down at Spain in this photo and consider how big a single car would appear. I mean, the Strait of Gibraltar is 9 miles wide. From this distance, that 9 miles is barely a few pixels. A satellite would be a fraction of that. And much the same with plane trails. The clouds visible in this photo are huge. They cover dozens of miles. If I bring up weather imagery websites, you can see there's clouds all over Earth, and from a distance it looks like there's just a smudge of clouds here around this region of the Atlantic near Gibraltar. If I zoom in, you can see it's 2 large clouds and then a few wispy clouds. Now, those look like they were condensation trails from a plane, but long after the plane's passed and they've dispersed hugely. But from a distance, even those are barely noticeable, and you'll also note that even in this weather imagery, there isn't hundreds of plane trails showing up even here. like some people think there should be on the Artemis photo. Because the reality is that the trails from planes aren't actually that wide. They might seem wide to us on the ground when they're only a few miles away from you, but from tens of thousands of miles, they're basically too small to resolve with a wide-angle lens. Now, I'm sure there will be plenty more coming out from Artemis that people will try calling fake, but those are going to be topics for another video. That's going to be it for today. As always, feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video and you haven't already done so, then please do consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons, and hopefully we'll see you in the next video.